And good afternoon, everybody. And thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Patrick Fuller. I am the Vice President of Legal Intelligence for ALM Intelligence, and I am joined today by Jen Scalzi and by Steve Kovalin. And welcome to both of you.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
All right, so today, guys, we're going to talk a little bit about two things. One, Jen, you and Steve kind of led the charge from our respective organizations on a survey that we did last year from June through July, where we did a survey with Calibrate Legal that I think we got some really interesting results from. We're going to talk about that today. And then the other part of that too is we took a lot of the results of that survey and we put it into a tool that is available on Legal Compass, and we'll cover that today as well. So with that, let's kind of get into the data, because we have a lot of interesting data points here and want to make sure that we have plenty of time to cover everything. So by the way of introduction, just for those that do not know, Jen Scalzi is the founder and CEO of Calibrate Legal. I've known Jen for a few years, let's just put it that way. Probably going back, what, 2003, Jen, somewhere in there, 2004?
Yeah, I was going to say about 15-ish years.
Yeah, and through that, kind of talk a little bit about your background through that time, because you've had a couple of different types of roles prior to starting Calibrate, and kind of walk us through a little bit of your background.
Sure. So I actually started the first 6 years. I was inside of a law firm doing marketing, attorney recruiting. I did some HR, I did billing, a little bit of everything, which I think has given me a really interesting perspective. Scroll forward a bunch of years. Since 2004, I have been focused on helping law firms build sophisticated marketing and business development teams. And about 2.5 years ago, we launched a marketing operations consulting division to help law firm marketing and business development professionals operate at their highest and best, to really help them, give them the tools so that they can prove the value that they have inside of a law firm, which we believe is enabling revenue to happen, right? So marketing professionals enable revenue to happen and really work alongside the revenue generators to impact the bottom line. So that is our mission at Calibrate.
Perfect. And our other panelist today, our co-panelist today, is Steve Kovalin. Steve is our Director of Research at ALM Intelligence. And Steve, can you kind of walk through a little bit of your background as well?
Sure. I have been with ALM Legal Intelligence about 4 years now, and I currently lead our survey research team. That's the team that's responsible for fielding surveys, such as the one that drove the data and provides the data that you're going to be seeing here today, but also some of those market-leading surveys like the AmLaw surveys of law firm financials, National Law Journal surveys on law firm headcount. We do all sorts of things in taking the pulse of the legal market.
Perfect. All right, so let's kind of walk through a little bit of the survey right here and the survey results. And so let's start first with the methodology and the overview. So we got roughly 888 responses from that, 84% of those coming from the United States. You'll see that 238 of those were first chair roles. And surprisingly, we got quite a bit of results from Canada as well. And Jen, I know that you have operations in Canada as well, but I think the actual numbers from that in terms of the LMA membership was pretty interesting as well too, correct?
Yeah, so we got, I think it was something like of the membership, we got something close to 80% or more of the LMA members to participate in this survey. So Canada is pretty well represented, even though it was only 15% of the data that we received.
And Jen, can we talk for a second about how we define first chair here, because I think we're going to use that off and on throughout the presentation, and how we worked with you to code and to classify the data by first chair, and some of the differences between, say, just what might be labeled as a C-suite role or a chief role, and what we mean when we say first chair.
Right. Thank you for that call out. It's a conversation that we had internally with several folks from the ALM team, and it was something that I felt really, really strongly about. So that's why you'll see that here, even though we do use C-level and C-suite in some of the slides that you'll see later. So I think it's really important to know that historically within law firms, that the C title across the board has not necessarily always been embraced, right? So particularly if you look at some very, very profitable firms that are based in New York City, there are still some of those firms who are really well known and, again, very, very profitable, who still use the top title for their marketing professional in their finance and IT, et cetera, as director. However, they're compensated much more similarly to what you might find with others who are called chief. And so as we were looking at how to slice and dice the data, we found that lumping people whose title that we knew held a first chair position, lumping those in with a director, which you might more generally consider a second chair position under a chief, it just wasn't an accurate portrayal of the comp that a second tier position under a chief would actually get, right? So we went ahead and went line by line, and were able to sort of figure out which professionals, and we also had a question that said, are you the lead professional, which was very helpful. But we found that 238 people that responded to the survey held the ultimate responsibility for marketing, business development, communications, whatever that group was called. And so we call those first chair. And anybody who knows me and our team, that's a title that we use all the time, because again, chief isn't necessarily indicative of, or director shouldn't be dismissed, because they are very sophisticated professionals who just sit in a culture that's a little bit different and hasn't embraced the chief mindset so far. So I hope that's helpful in kind of defining what that means.
And we'll recognize that sometimes there are cases here that where we refer to the director role, but not in a first chair context. So that would be a situation, right, Jen, where we have identified that organization as having someone in the C-suite with a C title, and then a director underneath him or her there.
Yeah, so we'll be sure to be careful when we talk about director versus chief later on, and we'll make sure and we'll denote what we're talking about there. But generally speaking, throughout the course of this conversation today, I think the audience should assume that if we're talking director, then that means a director that sits in the organizational model underneath a chief. So it's a second level position.
Okay. So I want to switch gears kind of briefly to get into some additional data points that were part of a report that we co-authored with Calibrate, and kind of brought together a couple of different sets of data from different surveys. But it's also, I think, it's really important to be able to look at where the profession and the functionality and the role has gone over the last 15 to 20 years. And I think, one of the things that becomes really interesting is if you look at it, going back, even 3 decades ago, for example, right? The median size of an Am Law 100 firm is more than doubled in size. So that in and of itself, if we move to the top part of this, to the upper right-hand corner, and by the way, we put a lot of information on this slide. I'm sure I'm driving a lot of folks nuts with how much information is on this slide, but it's important information, is we're getting into something we refer to as volatility, right? And one of the things within this is we've seen, a increase or decrease in any, key law firm metric. And just looking at revenue volatility in and of itself, 79% have seen a decrease in revenue at least once over the last 3 years. and you start seeing, of revenue growth over the last 3 years. And so you start seeing that level of volatility, including high volatility, right? 25%. And it makes, again, it's adding complexity into the job. From 1997 to 2017, the number of law firms that experienced year-over-year revenue growth of less than 1%, 1% in 1997, 33% by 2017. And then you have firms that are more geographically spread out, right? So the median firm in 2018, AmLaw 100 firm, had 18 offices across 3 different continents, right? So again, now, managing the function has become much more difficult. And of course, you've seen the growth in billion-dollar firms as well, too. So to Steve and to Jen, when you look at this, and Jen, I'll start with you on this, because you're in this business. When you look at the complexity that the role has become, what does it say to you?
Well, it says to me that law firms, I always say this story, so some of you may have heard it, but if you think about the educational background of lawyers, right? We looked at the stats of undergraduate degrees at the ABA, from the ABA rather, their stats that they have on their lawyers, and the majority of them hold undergraduate degrees that have nothing at all to do with business or marketing, right? So it's English majors, history majors, poli-sci majors, anything to not go into the business school and take those marketing and economics classes, right? Then they go to law school where they learn linear thinking and everything's black and white and there's no team, right? Like in an MBA program, you do teams. That's not how it works. Then they go to the law factory where they're hazed for 9 years, and then magically they're supposed to, be able to drive revenue. And it's just something that the leaders of today's law firms are truly understanding 2 things. The first is that they aren't necessarily trained business people. Some of them happen to be pretty good at it instinctively, but most of them, I think, are realizing that in order to compete in tomorrow's landscape, they've got to prepare today by adding really sophisticated business services professionals and include them in the conversation and ask their opinion, and more often than not, receive guidance and take the guidance. So, with any business, when you scale, there's not enough of you to go around, especially with so many partners, I think, that are still actively practicing and running the business of the firm. We all know that running the business of the firm is a full-time job by itself. So imagine adding, billable hours to that. So it's just not, if you're thinking on a scale, it's not doable. And so it's actually imperative for tomorrow's law firms to have business services people running the business.
Steve, your thoughts?
And so, well, the title of this webinar is cleverly, and credit to you, Patrick, on that, lawyers, marketers, and money. And here, I think we can say that money has 2 meanings. And of course, we're going to talk about money in terms of compensation here in just a second, but we're also talking money in this context too, which is the money, the revenue and profit of law firms. And so I think it's important for the audience to see, and as we talk about their compensation, the compensation for marketers and BD professionals, this is the environment in which you operate. This is what you're getting paid to do. This is what you're being paid to manage. You see issues of, like Patrick mentioned, of high volatility now. Everyone knows that there's an increasingly competitive market for legal services, not just among law firms, but now bringing in alternative providers such as the Big Four and law companies, legal tech, et cetera. And so as marketers, you are being paid to help smooth out this volatility. Businesses, they can take, sometimes volatility is positive in that maybe numbers unpredictably go up and up, but businesses prefer predictability. And so it's about this audience that's the marketing and BD professionals, how they develop programs within their firms and smooth out that volatility and develop predictable pipelines and help firms navigate the environment that's laid out here in the data.
Yeah, and I would add 2 things to what Jen and Steve both said. I think the one thing I know from from a consultative perspective that all of us try and do. Jen does this, and we do this at our team, with our team as well, is part of our goal is to provide data, tools, and insight to help people sell internally. And that's something Jen and I have spent some time talking about over the years is how to sell effectively internally, because that's a lot of our jobs, both whether we're in law firms or whether we're in organizations. You know, the most difficult sale is always going to be that sale that is internal. And I think the second part of it too comes in within that to some degree is managing expectations, because as the complexity increases of the market, and we're seeing it with, you know, the volatility in the numbers, and then you have the client taking more work in-house, the ability of the marketers to help the lawyers be able to create not just differentiation, but to be able to create demand around that differentiation becomes a much more critical skill set that I think is going to be really important moving forward. It has been for the last few years, but it's going to be even more so moving forward, simply because there has to be an increase in the velocity and throughput of business development for a lot of law firms right now. And you've got to be able to get, as business keeps churning, be able to, you know, help the lawyers close the deals faster than they have previously, and really get that foot going.
You're singing. It's a beautiful song. I love it. I think probably some of the audience members are saying, but you know, how do we condition the lawyers to be ready for us to have that kind of an impact? And that could be a whole separate topic, which we won't go down that path. But I will tell you, when we get to overall comp and drivers of comp, and particularly on the bonuses, when we get to that in a minute, the people who are able to tie their individual activities, and for those of you who manage a team, your team's activities to strategy that results in new matters coming in the door, those are the people that get more bonuses on a regular basis. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But that ability to prove your value is going to be absolutely key for, you know, starting yesterday actually.
No, that's perfect. A couple of other things that we pulled from throughout last year, and I know this is a question that we always get a lot of, is the percentage of firm-wide revenue spent on marketing and business development. You know, Jen, at 2.1%, that's kind of in line with what it's been. I remember back when I first started in the late 90s in this, it was in the 1% range, in the 1.7, 1.8% range. So I do think that is fairly consistent. But the thing I'm really interested in here too is you know, 2008, 2009, we started seeing a lot of reduction in teams. And so I think the thing I'm really kind of more curious about on this is the ratio of lawyers to marketing and business professionals. And have you seen that increasing over the last few years as well? Or
yes.
Same.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, absolutely. About 40% of the roles that we recruited for last year were additional headcount as opposed to replacement. So, and I would say, you know, they're absolutely increasing budget. They are absolutely spending more money on technological resources and the connectivity of those resources. They are, we're definitely not seeing any slowdown. And I will say that when we had the recession, the marketing BD teams, generally speaking, there were definitely some exceptions to this, but weren't the first ones that were cut. And sometimes in some firms, they weren't cut at all. They you know, scaled way back on events, et cetera. But they generally understood that business development and marketing is something you have to continue to invest in even when times are down. So I would say this is probably one of the better service lines to be inside of a law firm currently.
Okay. So talk a little bit about the share budget and the fact that budgets are rising. And I know, Steve, when we were putting some of this data together, you know, this was in some cases trying to map this information over from a taxonomy perspective. We had to put some you know, some things together through here. But if you could sort of walk through the allocation of marketing BD budgets and the impact with them rising.
And so, yeah, on the one side here, you see these various classifications we've given, and it really hits on some of the various functions and roles of the marketing and BD departments. And I think it's not entirely surprisingly that staff salaries is, I think, in any organization, just salaries and compensation are almost always the chief budgeting costs. But some of the other things is you see the role of events, and then you see that paired up of existing client development and new business development. That's interesting there at business development coming in at 30% of all budgets, but that new BD and existing BD, so sort of mining your existing client base, came in at roughly the same. And then you see toward the bottom some technology investments as well. And then maybe something that should see some more budget or more time allocated to is BD coaching. I think we could talk about how much lawyers, as Jen was mentioning previously, when they're in law school, they're not taught to be sales or marketers or developing these business skills. Perhaps maybe more focus could be given to business development coaching and holding those kinds of say internal events that can train up lawyers and help them go out to the market and be more successful.
Yeah, on the BD coaching, I think from my experience that this particular line is baked into most business development, people who have business development in their title. It's usually baked into their responsibilities. It's an expectation. So my advice to the listeners today would be to make sure that's a call out when you're showing your plan of activities for the year and also your results from the year. Be sure to track how much coaching you're doing, with whom, what some of those individual results are. I think that would be a really wonderful way in terms of lobbying for more bonus, et cetera. But it's interesting. There's a lot of business development coach, consultants, et cetera, in the market today, but it's typically baked in, frankly, to people's job description who don't have the bandwidth to do it. So that's probably why we see that there, where I think it's meant to be baked in, but there's just not enough time and energy.
And Jen, that activity goes back to our discussion of just previously about ROI, and so where you're coaching, and the benefit of that coaching may not necessarily be seen on your own internal line item, because what's happening is you're going out and you're training up someone else to go be successful, and so sometimes it's hard to demonstrate internally how you were a part or how you contributed to that. And I think that's important for you to have, as you mentioned and you pointed out, is being able to make note of that and how the coaching is contributing to the overall success of the organization, and making sure that that's not something that's lost.
Right. I mean, there's so many firms that, departments that are trying to prove return on investment on a campaign level, right? Which is a group of activities to support a business development initiative. But this business development coaching is a one-on-one thing, and it shouldn't be dismissed for you in terms of proving your value on the team.
Yeah, and one of the things that we didn't have in the questions last year that I'm going to have moving forward, I was fortunate. I was talking to a managing partner of a firm last week that they're bringing a new C-level, a new first chair role on, and that person actually is going to have pricing report up to them as well too. And I think one of the things that as we look at it, that moving forward, and it's going to be more of a client services role. But what's interesting about that is those of us who've ever carried a bag previously in our career, we'll be the first ones to tell you that we want to be the first line of negotiation with the client as well. And I think, it always, to me, it makes more sense as we get more of the senior roles to have the BD folks actually have a voice on the pricing side as well too, and to be able to help not only in some cases maybe not be directly involved in that, but have a voice in it. In this case, it's going to be a firm that's going to actually roll that role up into the Chief Client Services Officer, and I think that really could be a model for some of this moving forward as well, because I do think that bringing some of that client-facing interaction under one person is going to be the direction where we're going.
So we did a study last year that said that showed that most C-level professionals, the people with ultimate marketing accountability, were absolutely charged with implementing on strategy, but they were not involved in the discussion surrounding developing the strategy. And it's wrong on a lot of levels, but unfortunately, most marketing and business development people in today's law firms, once the matter is on the books, they're not involved in that client journey past the moment that the engagement letter is signed. And I think there's a huge amount that are also not engaged once you get to the, okay, we're getting ready to negotiate the numbers, the deal is almost done, they're out of the conversation at all. So I think the onus is going to be on today's professionals in this industry to learn about, law firm financials and really understand from a finance perspective how to begin influencing, being in the room for these pricing discussions.
I would say that just that ALM Intelligence did a separate survey also last year where we were looking at some of the roles and functions of the marketing and BD departments within law firms, and we saw tremendous variability between the levels of responsibility even among first chair roles at different firms within relatively homogeneous groups, say the AmLaw 200, where some C-level or first director roles had direct client-facing responsibilities. Others reported back and said there's no way that partners were letting them in the room with the clients. Some would say that yes, they're all a part of creating strategy. Others, just as Jen mentioned, are coming back and saying actually they're all implementing strategy. So it's very different even among, again, the largest firms in the U.S. I think you will continue to see trends toward growing responsibility of the marketing and BD department, more client-facing activity, more of the first chair roles having the seat at the table at crafting strategy. But at this point, it's still in a very transitional period from the old way of doing business to what I think will be a newer, more modern way.
All right, so let's start getting into some of the roles themselves, and this is again going back to the nomenclature we talked about at the beginning. This is titled with the chief roles, but we are also bringing in the senior-most, questions around the senior-most marketing and business development professional in the firm, et cetera. 6% of those that were surveyed were actually voting members of the firm's executive committee. 20% were non-voting members, and 3 out of 4 were not a member of the executive committee whatsoever, with an average of 26 years of professional experience, regardless of industry, for C-level roles. Jen, your thoughts on this?
My thought is, how on earth are marketing professionals supposed to be effective if they're not brought into the loop on the day-to-day business of the firm? I mean, it's a conundrum to me. That's my thought.
Steve?
I agree. It's about shaping the future of the firm as a business, and this is saying that still today, yeah, 3 and 4 are not a part of the executive committee. It's a little mind-boggling, and so it gets to that trend I was talking about before. I think you're going to continue to see more these numbers grow, but you can see that there's still a long way to go too.
Yeah, no, there absolutely is, and I think that's, I think there's two things on this that really jump out at me. One is the 3 out of 4, not a member of the executive committee. The other is the size of some of the teams, and really 36, a little close to 60% are more than 11 or more members of the team, and as the firms again get more spread out, I think that's going to continue to grow as well. The other thing that's kind of interesting here too is you start looking at the compensation ranges, and we'll spend a lot of time on this to go into some more direct areas, but the average cost of a C-level's total compensation per lawyer, myriad, when you compare it to if you're looking at potential ROI on that, it's relatively low per year, in my opinion, and combined with what they help bring to the table and the function that they perform, I think that's relatively low as well. And you start seeing some of the ranges here too. So the compensation per $1 million of firm revenue, the average to that is $1,291. The compensation per lawyer is $867, and per partner is $1,780. So you kind of see the range there of compensation. And within that as well too, we'll move over to the next slide here kind of quickly, is getting into the actual ranges for C-levels. And we did something a little bit different here. And Jen, we've got to talk about this. There's no way that we can't. We put it out the other day in an infographic and Steve, Steve put this data together, and here we are. And I'm just, as the white male on this, the one or two white males on this call, I'm just going to be quiet, and Jen, I'll let you take this.
Well, I think, it's not dissimilar to the last time you asked what I thought about something, which is, I don't, it's not fair, and I'm air quoting when I say fair. I will tell you that in the first chair roles that we run, the searches that we run at Calibrate Legal, I have never personally experienced a woman being offered or considered for less money than a man. I will say that on the one hand, with the salary legislation rules that have happened in terms of particularly in New York City, but we've made it a rule across our organization, we don't ask for comp anymore. We can't in New York, right? And so we go to market now with a salary range that has been determined for the position, as opposed to basing it off of, the standard percentage of increase that's allowed when you move from one firm to another. So I think on that side of the coin, it's definitely helped. So I would say that I think we're headed in the right direction. I think, we just got an offer for a candidate earlier this week for a first chair position, and it is a woman, and they came in over what they had said that they were going to offer, because it was so important that they get her, and the way that they treated her throughout the process was just amazing. They treated her, they put us through the same process as they would, as they typically do a lateral partner recruit. So the tides are changing. It's very exciting. And I can tell you that those of us in the recruiting space are working very hard to make sure that we're not intentionally trying to make the gap the way that it is. But I think it's coming around. It really is.
Steve, any thoughts?
First, sadness. But other than that, I mean, I don't know the answer to this, how you fix this, but I think it's also worth pointing out just the odd dichotomy there that you see in the bar chart between women holding the chief role by size of firm. And I'm kind of racking up my brain for what would explain that for the smaller firms that it's 95% women in these roles. But as you get to larger firms, you see men generally take a greater and greater share. A little bit different there with the 500 to 999, but there's something happening there, and I don't know.
I think,
what it is.
If I was going to go with that particular line, the 500 and 999, I would probably say that that particular size of firm, and again, generally speaking, is more focused on business development than marketing. And typically people who have a business development / sales oriented background are typically men, right? And so I think that could make sense why we might see a few more men in those types of roles, because that's typically what they're looking for, as opposed to the largest of the large firms, where you see firms that are looking for definitely business development focus, but more of a holistic focus with marketing and communications in their repertoire as well. And that tends to be more women than men on the Marcom creative side.
And so would you say that pure marketing, putting on events, etc., is typically or historically gendered as a role for women, and that could be what's being reflected in the roles of the smaller firm? And
I would say that.
But then it appears though that as the role gains more responsibility, notice that what happens is men come in and start pushing out women.
Yep, I think that's right. And I think
there's
because
got to be all sorts of unconscious bias and maybe conscious bias baked into those numbers, but
I think that's right. And I think there's women, if you look at the evolution of legal marketing, the very first batch of people, a lot of them were, assistants, paralegals, secretaries, whoever, who did an amazing job and worked their way up. And so there could be some of that. But I will say, again, going back to that business development, sales mindedness, it's typically has been men. And then if you look at the people that are ultimately hiring for these roles, is a managing partner, and typically managing partners of these large law firms are men. So we're making progress. I would say that the future is bright. It just doesn't look so hot right this second. Better than it was 5 years ago, I promise you that.
Well, this is true. And as we move from the C-level side down to directors, again, higher percentage of those roles are held by women in through there. And here's where there's a little bit different salary range disparity as well too. And I think part of this, and I want to make sure we go to this because Jen, you kind of alluded to this. This is where you did break it up between C-level and directors, where we do have some of the larger New York firms, and a couple of those that are also on the West Coast as well too, where they do use director for the first chair as well.
Yeah, so that's where you'll see the numbers on the left there with the female going up to like 6, whatever it is, in between 6 and 7. That's where you'll see that first chair role in one of the New York City type firms. That's where that sits. Otherwise, it would be, obviously lower than that.
One of the questions, by the way, that's come in already, and I want to address as we kind of roll this over into looking at managers as well, is if you have a JD, does your involvement with the executive committee and compensation, does that sort of all get raised up a little bit, or does the JD even matter?
I don't find that it matters. I think it matters how savvy you are. What is your ability to prove your value? What is your ability to articulate your position and to show that you're here and you make a difference, and I'd like you to compensate me for it, or else I'll go somewhere else that will, right? It's about it's about the hustle. It's about your ability to articulate your value. It doesn't matter what degree you have. So the most, I know somebody who has a voting position on an executive committee that's not a lawyer, and that person makes sure that those lawyers know exactly the contribution that they make and their team makes on a regular, ongoing basis.
And Jen, do you think there's value in the C title? Should those first chair directors be pushing to have their firm convert to their title, to having a C title and having that prestige or certain cachet that comes with having that label? Is there maybe an inherent compensation bump that comes with getting that?
Yep, absolutely. I think if you look at the client makeup of your top 100 clients for most law firms and the organizational structure that they hold, they all have C-level, a C-suite, and they all allow them to help run the business. I get that it's a different environment. The partners are the owners of the company, of the firm. I get it, but I would say though, if don't call them a chief if you're not going to actually allow them to guide you. So just keep and know what you're walking into, and if they're not going to give you that opportunity to earn the seat at the table, maybe you don't want to work there anyway. But yes, chief, it really ought to be at the level to which you want them to function.
Let's talk really quickly about managers for this, and the one thing just kind of jumps out at managers is there is much better equality, although there is still a little bit of a difference in average. The low end for men is not nearly similar to the low end for women through this, but that's also looking at it in aggregate, and there's a higher percentage of women with the smaller firms than there are with men as well. So that's going to naturally sort of bring that down a little bit more. But Jen, as we kind of wrap up the survey portion of this, you counsel, and I know you do, whether it's formally or informally, a lot of professionals on their career. And I've personally sat in sessions that you've done where we've been on the same dais and watched you talk and really give kind of real talk, for lack of a better term, to people about their careers and their desire to move jobs and everything else. When you talk to managers who are in firms, what's the best advice that you can give them about progressing their career?
I think that it's what I've been saying all along, which is track what you do, how you do it, and the impact that you make on an individual level. Ensure that the work that you're doing and the work that the lawyers you're responsible for are doing aligns with firm strategy. If you're not privy to what the firm strategy is, find somebody who will help you understand what the strategy is. Show your value, make them understand what it is that you do. Most lawyers, like I mentioned, they don't have a marketing acumen. They're very smart people, but they just haven't, for whatever reason, had a moment to come up to speed with what marketing and business development is and is not. And so the onus is on everybody at any level within a department to, on a regular basis, appropriately educate the partners and the lawyers in general on what it is that you do and how you do it. And sometimes it's also educating them on what you don't do and why not, right? So showing your value, and not in a boisterous way, but as a valued contributor, that's the most important thing you can do.
I'll say, just as I'm looking at this, these graphs and the salary ranges, what is really striking to me as we see this in a static format, and Patrick's going to talk in a second here about ways that ALM provides that we can look at some of this data more dynamically. I'm asking myself the question, wow, boy, there is a huge disparity for both men and women in the bonuses, where you see some managers getting up to $150,000 a year bonus, and others are experiencing nothing. Boy, what a difference in overall total compensation. And I'm just now running through my head. I'd like to see that by size of firm. And I know Patrick's going to talk about here ways that you can dynamically look at stuff like that, and you're just not stuck with these static charts as we're presenting them here.
Yeah, I mean, when we do searches, sometimes the bonus ranges are lower, therefore they make the base higher, and sometimes the upside is much higher, so the base is a little bit lower, and so those are all things to consider.
Yeah, and that was the perfect segue into this as we kind of get into how we took all this information, we put it together in a tool. And the one thing I'll just kind of briefly hit on is what we're talking about on this call, and what we talk about offline, by the way, too, is and it's not just amongst our team, but you know, Jen, you've been part of a lot of these conversations, is how can we provide tools and data that enable people to be more effective at their jobs. And it's not so much about the external use of everything as much as it is about the internal use of everything. And so whether it's with the marketing compensation, you see partner compensation on there, you see, you know, we released last year a merger tool that allows you to actually look at various dance partners and project out where the rankings are going to be, right? What's the combined revenue going to look like? What's the the revenue per lawyer ranking, and projected revenue per lawyer, projected profitability, and even model out large lateral strategy with that. So we're trying to put a lot of this data together in order to put it into a visualization that allows people to utilize it externally. And yes, I did have a little bit of fun with some animation on this. If I'm getting anybody seasick, I'm going to change slides real quick. So what we did is we took all the data that we gathered with Jen, and we put it together in a tool. And the tool allowed you to look at the data through a variety of different criteria. And whether it was single criteria or multiple criteria, it allowed you to sort of slice and dice and cut the data in different ways. So for example, you know, as you can see here, I put in Steve's salary, and but I put in, you know, sort of a mythical. I was wondering when he's going to come off of mute to bring the chuckle in. But we put in numbers that could be fairly plausible, right? With a $425,000 base salary and $85,000 max bonus, bringing the on-target earnings a little north of $500,000 at that point. 22 people in the department with 7 direct reports and 950 lawyers at the firm. And what this enables us to do then is benchmark and compare those numbers, if that's the compensation that we're looking at, by, you know, let's say for example that we have offices in the Midwest and the Northeast, we're substantial operations. You know, we want to be able to compare ourselves there, along with, for example, both, we can slice this by male or female, bring in different levels, firm sizes, et cetera, years of experience within the professional. And we can bring all that together. And what it enables us to do is not just see, you know, what the ranges are, but where we fall relative to that range. And part of the reason why we wanted to put that out there was for internal use, right? So as you start looking at this, because I look at this data and I see it obviously for our own myopic use. I don't think anybody on this call, certainly nobody that is a panelist today, that went to college solely to get smarter, right? We all went to college to increase our earning potential. But the other part of this, though, too, is that as we talk about the number of firms that are expanding, you know, 18 offices being the median in the AmLaw 100, not only are we going to have to, as leaders and managers, not only are we going to have to be instrumental in bringing people on board, but we're also assessing risk on a regular basis, right? Because the one thing that we don't want is turnover. And part of what we want to be able to understand on a consistent basis is, are we underpaying people in certain areas? Similar thing that we talk about with the partner compensation. It's not only about replacement cost, it's also about understanding risk and where you can be poached, right? Especially if you start seeing, you know, a good example, Jen, and I think you could talk a little bit about this, was, you know, 7-8 years ago when Houston started exploding, you know, a lot of the roles that you were hiring for were paying at a much higher level than what Texas typically did, simply because of the lack of capacity, right? There was a level of scarcity for some of the key roles.
Yeah, we had a supply and demand. It was the classic supply and demand issue. We did not literally have enough bodies to go around to fill the positions that were open. And so the firms were, you know, it was like funny money. And I said that to one of our clients in particular. I said, you don't, we'd love to get the commission off that placement, but I'm telling you, you don't have to pay that much, right? And I think they appreciated the honesty at the end of the day, and we did wind up finding some people in a reasonable range. But it definitely is, and they're doing that not just for marketing professionals, but for everything, lawyers, recruiters, everything. It's really interesting to watch.
And so that's what. Sorry, Steve, go ahead.
Sorry, Pat. I'd just like to mention really quickly here is how in the tool you started to answer some of the questions that I was asking in the previous slide. Now, granted, in the previous slide we were talking managers, and this is showing where you filtered to C-level roles in the slide. But what I was wondering is, are the bonus differences just solely a function of what was previously being displayed in the slide, bonuses across all firm sizes, or would you see that kind of difference in bonuses in firms of similar size? And in this case, you were able to use the tool and filter to firms from greater than 500 firms, or I'm sorry, greater than 500 lawyers. So again, a somewhat apples to apples comparison. We're talking big firms here, but you're seeing that there still is can be a wide range of bonuses and salaries among that group of firms, those large firms. And of course, you've benchmarked it against my salary and bonus, which we've intentionally kept a little low because I don't want to brag. But otherwise, this is the function of the tool is what you can ask questions like, are these numbers a function of firm size, and immediately filter and get the answer. And then also at the bottom, we also had included questions on the survey about job and career satisfaction. So you get a nice little bar there showing that on a 5-point scale, the career satisfaction of those C-level individuals within the filters employed by Patrick there.
And we also were able to look at, the staff and ratio benchmarking, and I think that's our next slide. It's really interesting to kind of show size of firm, how many people are on the team, direct reports, that kind of thing. We get those questions all the time. That's, none of you, I'm sure, have ever been asked by partners, what is the firm next door doing, right? So in the event that ever does happen, this would be an amazing tool to jump to. And then I think our last, go ahead.
Well, no, I think there's 2 points. So one, we asked the same question about going back one slide. We asked the same question on the partner compensation one about satisfaction. In fact, we asked it in a variety of different ways. And by the way, on the partner slide too, and there'll be an infographic coming out about this fairly soon, but the disparity, it was still there, by the way, by gender, and it was right around the same level, about 71%. But what was interesting was that the satisfaction levels were much different. Marketers generally, by this survey, and we can't say anything anecdotally, but more quantitatively from this survey, that how it was answered, are much more satisfied in their career than a lot of their partners are, right? And we all kind of knew that, but it was interesting to sort of see it bear out in the data itself. The other thing on this is I go back to the internal business case aspect of it. This is where Steve comes up to me and he says, you know what, I need a bigger staff, because if you look at this, look at where we are relative to everybody else that fits our same profile. We're doing much more with less, and we need to have more people on team. And this right here is kind of an interesting way of looking at this, this information. We'll finish up.
And it's also about showing that ROI and saying also it can be, see what everyone else is doing. Look what I'm delivering for you with my small staff. Aren't we great?
Yeah. And I can help spin that. I can help spin that story if anybody needs help. After we finish this one, Patrick, I was hoping we could go back a couple to the overarching, like the one that had the animation. I'd love to end with that one if we could.
No, that would be great. And so one final thing here we'll touch on this is just, the other question we asked too is who are you directly reporting to? We kind of let the marketing committee and through their executive committee as well. But overwhelmingly, there's a lot of people that were reporting directly to either the managing partner or the COO. And in the hours in the week, I didn't see as many more than 40 as I would have suggested. I know that we all do. We get, there's a lot of email exchange and texting going back and forth late at night when we're all catching up on email and things like that. So that is something that we also put in through here as well too. And now back to the funky animation.
Yeah, so this one, so we at Calibrate, we have Legal Compass, we subscribe to it, and it has been unbelievable in terms of looking at our client base. And so, for example, one of our clients has a goal of, switching or making better on some diversity initiatives. And so we were able to look at and model their trends and diversity against some of the firms that they cared about, right? For this, using the tool. It's really, really impressive, the competitive analysis. I mean, folks who are in professional development, attorney recruiting, should absolutely be looking at this as well. There's so much amazing information that they've compiled in here.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. That was not part of
our
plan.
I love it. I play with it like 4 or 5 times a day, just noodling around the what ifs with different firms.
Well, thank you very much. And that's all part of Legal Compass. Contact information, I think we're going to send the slides out. So contact information for our BD team led by Rob Alston. Rob can put you, depending on who contacts them, to Cole or to Evan or to Chris or to Ben as part of Rob's team, as well as Jeff and Kevin, who a lot of you are working with. I think everybody knows Jen, but if you don't, you need to. And again, I go back to this because and I'll echo a little bit of what I said earlier. I've sat and listened to Jen give the advice that people need to hear that's actionable and beneficial, and I think that becomes absolutely critical in terms of career. And then I'm going to finish on one thing here because we're right up against time. When we set the invite out, I realized that I'm getting super old, super fast, because I did get some questions back about what in the world did you mean by money? It's a gas. Grab that cash with both hands and make a stash. And I realized that when you start using Pink Floyd references at my age, that you generally lose half your audience pretty quickly. So that's pretty disturbing for me.
Hey, I was picking up what you were putting down, and I think Steve was too. So just surround yourself with like-minded people and you'll be fine.
There we go. So Jen, Steve, thank you both very much. We didn't have any other questions come in. If you do have questions, please reach out to Jen, reach out to myself, to Steve, to anybody in our team. We're happy to answer any of the questions that we can. We appreciate everybody joining. We probably could have had this conversation for about 3 hours.
Correct.
Actually. And so I appreciate the panelists and everybody kind of working through in the hour time frame that we had. So Jen, thank you very much. Steve, thank you very much.
Have a good one.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. That's going to conclude the program for today.